Okay, hi everyone. We're just going to give it a minute for the Zoom to trickle everyone in. I hope you're all doing well. And if you're joining us from Vancouver, I hope that you're staying dry. Hello and welcome to the Curator's Tour of Intersecting Orbits with Lisa Baldissera and David MacWilliam. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Rahmi Emin, and I'm the Assistant Curator of Engagement at Griffin Art Projects. Before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge that our work takes place on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Tsleil-Waututh and Squamish nations, to whom we are deeply grateful. As well, we would like to thank Canada Council for the Arts, North Vancouver Recreation and Culture, and the Fribey Foundation for their support towards this exhibition and its surrounding public programs. We are grateful to Odlum Brown for their sponsorship of Intersecting Orbits, Michael Morris and Joan Balzar. And lastly, I will mention that at the end of this program today, there will be a chance for an audience Q&A, and that includes the virtual audience. So if at any point you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat and we'll relay them to the dialogue box. And before we begin, I'll give a quick intro to the show. Joan Balzar and Michael Morris were foundational to the development of abstraction and conceptualism in British Columbia. To be within their orbit was part of a movement in the 70s, went on to become enduringly, as has been quoted. Co-curated by Lisa Baldissera and David MacWilliam, Intersecting Orbits presents the art, archives, and collections of Morris and Balzar to celebrate their converging influence on conceptualism on the West Coast. Two major collections bequeathed to the artist from the core of Intersecting Orbits were generously shared with the public for the first time through this exhibition. The Morris collection, presented courtesy of Michael's husband, Rahmi Emin, and Balzar's niece, Shawn Macmillan, collection, which features work from Balzar across the artist's career, additional loans from Macmillan's sister, Janice Haakons, and the Darrin Stephanie Edwards collection, and the West Vancouver Museum, highlight movements in artistic development. And without further ado, I will pass it on to Lisa and David to begin.
Victoria, 1999. So I hear that our online audience is joining us. Hello, everybody online. We're just getting started. So I'm just sharing that Joan Balzar came to the Art Gallery Greater Victoria in 1999 during my first year as a curator. And I was so thrilled to be introduced to this work that I had never heard of before, and was wondering after I met her why on earth had I not heard about this amazing artist. And what had happened was Joan came into the office and said, hey, you know, she had a great pantsuit on and she looked amazing, and she said, I've got this artwork. If you're not interested, it's just fine, but I'll just send you a picture. And she sent me a picture of this work, Moonbeam, I believe it's Moonbeam 2. And it was one of her neon works. So the zip of yellow neon through the middle of this beautifully modulated blue and yellow painting, sort of like a flag, a 4x6 flag on either side. And I thought, I have no idea who this person is, so I'm going to find out. And we brought that, and that was our first work of Joan's in the Art Gallery Greater Victoria collection. So that's where it resides now. So I was thrilled when I learned from Colleen about Shawn's collection. Shawn Macmillan is Joan Balzar's niece, and she has generously loaned most of the works that you see here in this, and there's a range from the 60s all the way through to 2002. And then we were so lucky to have loans from Janice Haakons, who's also a niece, and Stephanie Edwards, who's here with us today, and Darrin Morrison's collection, as well as the West Vancouver Museum. And we also were very fortunate to have an incredible loan from Michael Morris's widow, Rahmi Emin. Yeah, I'll let you talk now.
Okay. Thanks, Lisa. We're still adjusting to the technology, but I hope everyone can hear me. And I want to just acknowledge that we're here today with some people in the audience who, I don't know if you want to pan to show that there are people, but no, we're about to start talking about some of the work. But I just wanted to say that we were fortunate to be able to go to Brentwood Bay, to Michael, and in fact, Michael's mother's home in the late fall to meet with his husband Rahmi and go through a collection. So a lot of what you're seeing in this particular room, and we'll take a minute to go through it, was actually from the house and up on the walls in the house. And so kind of what you're seeing is a very intimate collection, and just to acknowledge that artists do collect, and they collect in very particular ways, often by trading, often through gifts. And a big part of what you see in Michael's collection is because of that, but also I think we're going to start talking about Michael's mother Rita's collection, which Michael inherited when she passed in 2005. And maybe I'm going to ask Lisa to give a bit of background about some of these Victoria artists, the limners that some of you may recognize, like Maxwell Bates, and maybe to contextualize it, because these are artists that the Vancouver community may not necessarily know about, but were hugely influential in Victoria after the Second World War through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, which contextualizes where Michael came from and how this work came into being.
And thank you, David, because I think one of the things that I felt after working at the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria for 10 years was that maybe I was geographically challenged, and that Vancouver Island was actually sort of floating off the coast of Maui for the amount of attention it was getting in the Greater Vancouver and the regional art history. There tended to be this very siloed sense of how these art histories unfolded. And so I'm really thrilled to revisit this moment, because certainly when I started in Victoria in the 90s, we were looking more at conceptual work. We were looking at the works that were coming out of UVic's scene in the 70s, Roland Brenner, Maury Baden. But prior to that had been this group of post-war artists who were trying to push back against that sort of sublime landscape tradition. But also some of them had emigrated post-war, like Herbert Siebner. We have one small work by Herbert Siebner here. A painting, not actually very much of it's so much more of a kind of classical, you almost see that European post-impressionist influence in this work. So it's a very kind of conservative work for him and for what he's did later. And then there's just a very small drawing of Herbert Siebner's here. So he had emigrated after the Second World War. And then we had people like Colin Graham coming up from California and bringing all of that arts and crafts movement, all of the history of architecture from that place. Margaret Peterson came at that same time. We had people like Sybil Andrews that came from England. So there was part of a board assist movement, which was a really interesting kind of political approach to abstraction and printmaking and from the UK. So in this brew, though, was this very small group of artists who was looking for how to create a convivial space so that they could support each other as they kind of pushed out against these very conservative traditions at that time. And the Limners was formalized in the 70s, but they started much earlier.
Thanks. Just to contextualize our plan for this talk, our hope is that we're going to talk for about an hour, and we're going to take you through this exhibition, which is really in 3 rooms, and we're in the first of the 3 rooms. And this is kind of rooted in a historical part of the show, but also we're hoping that at the end of an hour or however long it takes us, that we would be open for questions, which we would welcome from the audience. Lisa touched on this painting of Siebner's, but I also just want to show you a very early painting of Michael Morris's here from 1959. So just to explain a bit about Michael, his mother was very active in this Victoria scene that Lisa's described. And as a mother, she was also incredibly proud of her young son, who she saw as a future art star, and kept a lot of his very early work, including that piece. There's a piece here we haven't dated, but is from around that time, and what you start to see is some of the early themes, in particular in Michael's work, and the attention to the figure, in particular the male figure. So we're going to start to see that, but maybe before we get too far, we just want to also touch on these 2 works of Maxwell Bates. And we believe, in fact, that in this painting, and I can't remember the exact title, but that this is in fact Michael's mother, Rita, in costume. So, and you can see, if you noticed as you came in, there are a number of photographs that kind of you'll sort of recognize here, but also to acknowledge that this was the kind of parties that I guess happened in Victoria in 1967. And there's some, within this crowd, there's people like Robin Skelton who taught at UVic and so on and so on. So Victoria was a very active scene, but also before we get too far, I just also want to touch on this Louis Bunce painting, that this is a Portland artist. And I guess the other comment we wanted to make was that in those days, the border was a lot more porous, and there was a lot of connection between Portland, Seattle, Victoria, Vancouver, even San Francisco and Los Angeles. And work was moving up and down, and we see influences by a number of artists. We were talking about Mark Toby the other day, who influenced artists in Vancouver, Victoria, Seattle, Portland, and so on. And Louis, I gather, was, as you can see, an expressive abstract painter. And this was a prominent piece within Rita's collection that was on the wall at her home.
We do have a little painting by Rita here at the bottom. So just this little landscape painting. And as David was referring to, we've got a really wonderful series of photographs, including one where they're all painting on plein air. And you see Michael and his mom. Michael's probably about 16 at the time, and they're working together. And so, and Rita herself was an art educator. So you can see Rita and Michael just in this Mafon Pavlik painting right at the far end here. And Mafon Pavlik was one of the limners, probably one of the high points of her career was painting Pierre Elliott Trudeau, and quite a famous painting that she became well known for. And it's just a very romantic and beautiful and loving piece. Like when I look at that, I can really see the relationship both between Michael and his mom, and also of the limners themselves. So, you know, what that meant to create a community around yourself of that at that time. And I think that the interesting part of that crossing borders, that is, you know, that real West Coast kind of scene that was happening at that time was part of that. As I mentioned, Colin Graham came from Berkeley, from San Francisco, and that was a big part of his vision as the first director of the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria, actually, when it was formalized as an institution. So I think it's really interesting. So I recognize Rita. I did meet her in 1999 as well with Michael. Michael had come back from Berlin to be with his mom. And this is Lady Lurex. So that was her nickname. That was her party name. And I think it's really interesting because Michael actually has those throughout his own career. Like he's got his own Marcel Dot, and you know, it sort of persists what started at the beginning with this sense of a total life in art. Like it really wasn't just about being in the studio. It really was about being part of a community. And I think we see that in Michael's generosity throughout his life, how he always brought people in, and he was always very curious about what they were up to, artists from all ages, you know. And I think you'll see that, as David was saying, throughout the collection, you can see there's these key gifts too from artists and exchanges and things that are going on. This piece here is Attila Richard Lukács work. And if you look very closely, it says for Rita. So it's just this really beautiful testament to you know, how many years he spent at their house as well. So they collected people as much as they collected art together. So I think that's also a really important thing to note. And then, you know, to see what Michael is looking at in the 60s. So he's left home by now. He's in his mid-20s. This is a 1967 work, but 1975, Michael's doing this watercolor. So it's really interesting to see what gets in the brew, like as you're thinking as a young artist. This is what he's being surrounded by as he's starting to develop his own career and voice and confidence.
Thanks. We wanted to include this particular poster from the Douglas Gallery, and it's signed in '67. So by this point, Michael was in his mid-20s, but you can see he was already kind of imagining his name in lights. And we just thought it was nice to include that. That was sitting in the back, but also just a cluster of other people. So there's a very early Peter Schiff down here, a Rauschenberg, a Gwen Curry, beautiful double print, Jeff Hendricks, who's a Fluxus artist. Again, a range of people, Tom Burrows, this double-sided Gary Lee Nova, who was part of the original 3 Image Bank artists, along with Vincent and Michael. And so this wall is kind of a tightly hung. There's an Ed Peon down here, and then a woodcut of Michael's that actually Gwen printed, she told me. So there's just a cluster of pieces there. And then if we can move to this wall behind you, we're kind of shifting in time slightly. And Michael's collection continues with a number of artists, in particular, including Attila Lukács with this piece, that piece, the Polaroids from this collaboration that he did with Michael. These are Attila's Polaroids, but there, you'll see in the front, there's a book of from an exhibition that they did. But also, we thought it was important to acknowledge that Michael and a number of artists collected ceramics at this moment. And there was a huge interest in ceramics. And these are mostly pots from an artist named Mick Henry, who had a property in Robert Street called Babyland, which Michael and Vincent and Carol Itter initially bought into at a certain point. And there are pots from Mick's collection. There are, in fact, 3 Tam Irving pots back behind you, and Tam is here today, so we want to acknowledge that. And then on the back, also a number of pots by Wayne Gann that are incredibly beautiful and small and modest. So what else is here? Within Michael's career, he began to move away from painting towards performance, video, and photography. But there's a recurring interest in mirrors. And so we thought it was nice to include these 2 Cibachrome prints from, that would have been taken off the Sunshine Coast from that moment, I think, but this is a little bit later in terms of timing. And then there's also Vincent Trazoff piece, Female Voices, where he was experimenting with using heat and transfer for how does paint set into paper. So there's that piece, which also led to a lot of other works that he did at that time. And then there's this other little lovely double portrait again of Michael and Rita that, yeah. I'll pass it back to Lisa. We can make a
very sophisticated mic system. I also just wanted to mention about Babyland, again, another convivial space of creating a site for artists to gather, for art to be made. So again, he sort of carries forward that sense of how to create not just individual works, but actually that sort of supportive artist environment that becomes so fruitful for creating a scene. And Babyland, the story, I believe, is that there were a number of pregnant women on site at a certain point in its early history. It's what got nicknamed Babyland because of all these ladies. So, and then from there were a number of the ceramics. Mick Henry was part of the Bernard Leach studio training. So there was that early training from Cornwall that got brought back through these artists and Glenn Lewis. And so we have a kind of selection because, as Wayne Berwald mentioned, who's going to be speaking later in March about this history, this was really important to Michael, this collection. He really believed in what this represented, the kind of formal elements of this work, its innovation. He felt that this was so important not to be seen as utilitarian work, but as fine art objects in their own right. So, so that was another part of, in a way, his support structure that he was building. We have a little piece by Colette there that shows Michael and Vincent. So, you know, just a little Polaroid. So again, there's these currents of relationship that run through all of these works.
I'm just going to counter what Lisa said, because in fact, yes, well, these are beautiful objects. You could also eat with them, from them, and use them for, yeah. I think, are we?
Can I just touch on Bill Bissett and this early work by Michael that's kind of a prototype work right behind you? So we know that language is also really important. Sorry. Language is also really important as Michael was working through that sort of interdisciplinarity that was happening, and it was happening in a lot of that sort of moment of frisson in the mid 60s that was happening through exhibitions at UBC. There were art and language exhibitions happening through Alvin Balkan and also Richard Simmons, bringing in British pop art at that time in the mid 60s. Intermedia starts up at that time, but this sense of the disciplines kind of melting away. So you have Bill Bissett, who's a poet, who's then making forays into art without necessarily declaring himself an artist. He's just working, and that falling away. And I really have to say that as we were installing, this moment started to feel like it was coming into focus as we were installing the work and seeing them all in proximity to each other, so that you could sort of feel the energy and openness of that time. And it made me feel a little nostalgic for something that I didn't experience directly, but yeah.
We wanted to start the exhibition with this particular painting as it's a transitional piece. I think it's 65 this was made. So this was at the moment when Michael was about to go to London for a year at the Slade. But here you can see it really is a kind of work in transition. I think there was a number of paintings made at this time, but stripes were starting to appear, but they were appearing still as stains. We want to imagine these are the North Shore Mountains. I don't know what they are, but here they are. I see them as the North Shore Mountains, but you can start to see these motifs that start to occur here that we'll see echoed more as we go more into the paintings in the large space.
So we'll just make our way into the larger space now. So we'll have a look at Michael's paintings from the mid 80s, from when he travels to Berlin. And there's another shift again as he moves to an international location, although he did in his early career earlier also study at Slade. So we know that this was Michael's second European sojourn. But the works in this room start to open up into this moment in the 80s. So we start with a very unusual piece that's just on this wall. This is from the mid 80s by Michael Morris.
We were surprised when we went to Brentwood Bay to see this painting in the living room. And it is a very unusual painting, but we both were really struck by how beautiful it was in terms of color, but also notions of foliage and the openness with which it's painted. And at the same time, there were a number of paintings stacked against another wall. And this is two paintings from 1985 that were also painted in Berlin. Again, Michael Morris at a kind of really interesting moment. There were maybe 10, 12 paintings around this size and really varied. But here you see a gradient, which we'll see recur in a number of places within the overall exhibition, but very crudely rendered in this case, very differently. So these were kind of a surprise for us, and thought they were really interesting to include.
And I'm just going to back up and introduce us to Joan Balzar's, the first work that we're going to talk about in the exhibition. And this piece is called Core. It's also from the mid 60s. So Joan is listed at the edges of the intermedia movement at this time. So we know that Michael Morris is involved in the intermedia movement at this time in the 60s. So we're backing up a little bit in terms of time frame. But what we see in this work is Joan's really her concern with light and optics. So she's thinking about perception, but everything that she's made in this show is handmade. There's no airbrushing. There's no other interventions. This is pure painting that she's doing all the way through. And so one of the things I thought was so interesting about this work, and we were both talking about it, was how we wanted to make sure that some of these sort of curvilinear works were included, because she had a period of time where she was really exploring that. She was interested in the space age and technology, and famously said to Bill Jeffries, "I just can't get into trees." So she would have been such an anomaly at this time, if you can imagine. She did her early training in Seattle at the Edson School in Seattle. And then she also traveled to Guatemala, and she traveled quite a bit to Mexico later and received early attention in 1959 in Antigua through a major solo exhibition there, and in the early 60s as well in Guatemala through the National Biblioteca in Guatemala. So she's getting that recognition. And I think how interesting to cross borders to continually kind of reinvent yourself as you experience certain strictures at home. So for her, some of the strictures were about gender. They were about trying to find her way in a world that, first of all, abstract painting, but second of all, these massive, I mean, I think about her navigating this very quietly the way she did that afternoon when she visited me and said, you can take them or leave them. It's okay with me. But these are massively demanding, scaled pieces. Like they're not shy works by any stretch of the imagination. And the only one last thing I'll just say, which is just, if you think about how she's using this gradient, and that really struck us both, you know, as she's working through hard edge abstraction, but she's also concerned with emanation and light. And it's not, I mean, there's been some discussion, is it abstract or is it not abstract? At what point does it become a non-abstract painting? But she certainly was interested in emanation. And so she's very diligently painting these glows and suggesting that we might have a synaptical optical experience as we're standing in front of these paintings, that simultaneity of an optical experience. And what I really love is then what happens over here in the 80s is Michael says, nah, this is pure pop, right? He's doing the gradient here, but he's really thinking about it as a disembedded kind of quote of a certain kind of art history. So I just love the way that 20 years later, we see all of these innovations, and especially the struggle of painting at this time. Like, you know, I remember, like, I think painting, it was very, very difficult to think about painting as a conceptual, having a conceptual space at all within the conceptual art movement. And so it's really feels timely to me to look at these and think about them in terms of what were conceptual innovations within this work when they're both thinking about, Joan's thinking about perception against the space age, against the landing, the two moon landings, the Soviet and the American moon landing, thinking about what all of the hope, the utopian hope, the flood of utopian hope at that moment. So it's a very interesting, I think, art historical moment to come back at as we think about painting as well. So these two sort of narratives together.
Thanks. I wonder if we can walk over to these two paintings behind you, and I want to talk about this one particularly wild, zany painting that we were both really struck by when we saw it in Shawn's. Yeah, and I just want to talk, just to follow up on what Lisa was saying. So what we're seeing is a very procedural painting. This painting was planned. So it's not spontaneous or gestural in any way in what we see with those paintings of Michael's, but you can see literally how she mapped it out. She had a plan, she started it, and she proceeded. But what's interesting within it, besides the opticality that you get from looking at it from a distance, then from close up, is she's also doing all these other little tropes, like this blended gradient of this white that transitions and gets darker towards the edges, so you can feel optically how it kind of rolls for you. And we'll see that echoed in Michael's strategy, but in a very different way, because he's painting, again, gradients, but they're masked and hard edge. So what's interesting about this particular one is you get this notion of light emanating from these bands that then, in some ways, seems to, in my imagination at least, lead us to Joan's desire to use light, in this case neon, which she used in more than one of her paintings. And we were fortunate to be able to borrow this particular painting from the West Vancouver Art Museum, because we wanted to be able to show you a piece that used neon. And it's a really extraordinary piece. And again, you can see how she's blending to create these gradient transitions that feel like they're spray painted, but they're not. So they're very very well done in terms of technically complicated. And she's using acrylic, which is particularly hard to blend in this way. So.
And also, if we think about this work in terms of what's emerging at that time, this is the time where we see the advertising industry taking hold. So what does it mean to have something that you can see at a glance that functions almost in a branding way? Like it's the beginning of that advertising language that's simplified form. So those blocks that David was referring to are replicated behind you in this piece, this X. This is called Silverscape from the mid-60s as well. So this is then replicated with W from 2002. So you can see that these two paintings are 40 years apart. So it's 40 years of development of our ideas of shared minimal kind of the minimal summaries of advertising language. Because as advertising emerged, it taught us how to look at things at a glance, how to have a summary kind of at a glance. So she's looking at, hanging the armature of an abstract painting on this kind of X, and then it just gets minimized even further into the W to the right. So you see that things become both an abstract language, but then they're also referencing popular culture in some ways as she goes over that arc.
And maybe also I could draw your attention to the fact that she's also experimenting with paints. So here she's using an aluminum paint, which was, again, came out of sign painting industry, not fine art in terms of as a choice of materials. But also you can see within the blending, there's this slight shakiness of her hand. So you can see as you start to look at these gradients, how they're painted, and they're just a little bit wonky. So they're not perfect in that sense. And I think that's what also makes this a very compelling painting.
And again, this is taking place at the same time as Expo 67. So there's all of that energy around architecture and around thinking through what the offerings are of this space. So this kind of merging of architecture, these fine art, and the capacities for them to move into more of a widespread shared kind of register. So when you think about what was happening at Expo 68, it was the idea that Canada was finally emerging onto a global stage. It's kind of what the Limners were struggling with. They were struggling against kind of regionalism at the same time as Canada really was struggling about a kind of cultural regionalism at the same time. So this kind of very bold work that's happening really like just the year before Expo 68, I think that it's important to sort of think about what's happening all at the same time as she's doing this work.
We thought it was really important to include this very beautiful painting here. It's smaller, a bit more modest in scale, but also if you look at it in detail, you can see how, again, she's still masking these edges, but in a way they're functioning in a very different way. And again, as you look closely, you'll be able to see sort of technically how it's painted, but you can see how closely she's modulating the color to create the illusion.
I just find it just fascinating that these are 40 years apart. And also, what does it mean? Like there's this sort of eclecticism that we understand in contemporary art. You're moving across materials, media, discursive spaces, but there is something really riveting about someone staying with this project that they've set out for themselves, and that she's done so with innovation. It's very subtle all the way through. And again, I think I mentioned she was on the edge of the intermedia movement, but she kept with her concern was painting. And her concern was how light could be represented through painting. So she had a singularity in that focus.
If we move into the back room, we're going to show. Oh, okay. Neil's asked if we could talk about this painting before we. When we were going through the archive of Joan's collection, there were a number of paintings this size that were. This is unusual in terms of format because it's so square, but Also, you can see how beautifully she rolls, how the illusion of basically almost a cylinder is created just through paint. But also this transition between warmer grays and colder grays that also creates a very unusual structure. And there were several paintings this size, and again, this width of bands. And we thought this was a really beautiful example of that. We're going to go to this back corner where the oldest painting of Joan's is. I don't know if we can all get in here. Lisa, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe so. This would have been a painting that she would have made when she was an art student.
Around 50s.
So this is late 50s, just at that end of her art student days. You can see it was painted with a knife, a palette knife. But you can also see the paint was very wet, probably an oil paint, and as it dries, you can see how it's reticulating in these various details. So in terms of that moment, you can see literally as you look at this, how the painting was made, how far she was dragging each color, how it was wet on top of wet. It reveals what's underneath. And I think it has some reference to wet city, Vancouver.
Yeah, that's what we just read about. This is a new bit of information, but that she was looking very much about the urban landscape at night and what this looked like to capture this light again. So it's an interesting early iteration of this project of light in this work. So here she did work into a little bit later, sort of toward the end of her life, enhancing some of those pinks that you're seeing there because they had faded. How much they digress from what her initial intent was with the work, but you can definitely see like Riopelle, what was going on in the 50s at this point where all that texture, all that we saw with Michael's early work. So you see that she's coming out of this, and it's always so interesting to see, you know, at this point, an artist can go in any direction. This is her emerging from a certain historical moment and making decisions, and yet she's still interested in light and in that kind of possibility of light. So we deliberately put this work right next to it, which is from 1999 called Neon Highway. And so you see, like, imagining all the steps between this work and this work. So it's still very much about a painter knowing how to, you know, this is not airbrushing. These subtle modulations are coming out of this capacity to make an informed mark after almost 50 years of painting. And just the, you know, for here, this Neon Highway then becomes this kind of, you know, we can't imagine the same painter who did this lush, dark, sort of quasi-narrative scene, then creating this work that summarizes all of these things over many, many years.
And then maybe just to touch on this, the other issue that you can imagine coming up is this a landscape? Is this, and we've had experience seeing, you know, paintings of a similar feel from the prairies and so on. Is this water? Is this perspectival space that has, you know, sky, water, and then this foreground? Or is it an abstract painting, as Lisa was just saying of the one behind us? So this also is, and there were a number of paintings like this, as well as this yellow one behind us that we'll come to in a sec. So, but you can see how the waving of this blue line, it's not straight, so it's taped, but it's not perfect. So she's masking, but she's not worrying about having it perfectly straight.
It just really feels like an example of three different languages, three different formal languages that she's using in this corner. And, you know, without feeling that she has to make a kind of allegiance to any one of them. And so this one, the surface is so interesting too, because it's just this very opaque surface that there's only one section that's actually reflective. So you think about our project of light. This one feels like a real departure to me. It felt much more meditative, and that it needed its own space to look at it, because the way it's functioning formally is quite a bit different, I think, because of that matte kind of surface on this work. So we're going to now look on the other side. So I guess we'll start with this piece by Joan. So this is another kind of a Louvre kind of painting, like the gray piece that we saw in the other room. There's almost a feeling of hyper-realism in this one. You know, I don't know if I'm just projecting, and I always resent when art historians project. So I'm going to try not to, but I think that shows a little bit of a shift in her language that's happening in the 90s. So she's starting to, you know, you can imagine the fidelity to this project, but how she's, you know, the knowledge, if you come up close afterward and have a look at what she's doing here in terms of the blending, the knowledge of, you know, just these lightly ruddy and brown modulations with the yellow and the glow that comes out of this work. So we deliberately set it up against these two works by Michael Morris, because we were really interested in how this project of expanded painting continues in his work. So this is the 90s. This is much earlier. This is the 60s in Michael's work.
Michael made a number of works that had eccentric frames, but also were covered in plexi and acrylic. And some of them are in slight disrepair, but we thought it was really interesting to include this because here you can see literally how it was taped. So this is silk screen onto what seems like a fairly thin film that's then sandwiched between pieces of plexiglass, thicker acrylic. And it's only held by nails in a few corners. And then we in fact saw there was some tape. And then this painting, which is has a metal frame, a deep metal frame, as you see, and sadly got a little bit damaged, but Michael made 3 or 4 paintings, including one called Captain January, which the Vancouver Art Gallery has, that's in a similar thick metal frame. But this painting is called Sun-Kissed, and here you can see Michael's painting gradients, but again, they're taped, and you don't feel them rolling in the same way as Joan's paintings are. But also within this painting of Michael's, you see how he's got a frame within a frame within a frame within a frame. So it seems like that was also another device that he used, where if we call this the painting, then it's framed, and then it's framed again. And all these formal framing decisions that he's making. And then maybe if we can shift to the final wall, this is again back to Michael's collection. An earlier gouache from '65 that is, we think, a really stunning example. The end where you can see the gradients that are more formal there, but in this case, hand painted. We included a number of Vincent Trasov drawings. There's one above here, a Chris Cran, and then some pop art that was in his collection, including this Katai print, one of his teachers from the Slade, which you can see themes that echoed in Michael's work in a number of ways. The bands of color, the nudist hangout. In this case, it was Germany, but could have been Babyland on the Sunshine Coast. And then the Warhol and the Lichtenstein. And then maybe, Lisa, if you could talk about the terrace.
Yeah, it's something interesting about this thoughts of expanded painting. And Michael was thinking very much about Los Angeles car culture. That's what sort of inspired him to begin to do these frames in this way. And he was also concerned at that time, thinking about sort of the expression of narcissism through all of this work and what he was witnessing in Hollywood, and this kind of the marquee also really fascinated him. So all of those kind of come into that extension of expanded painting. So it sort of meets the scumbling of popular culture, of lived experience, and formalism all come together in those choices, which I think is really quite neat. And then you sort of see what might be his interest in Taras Politeko's work. So this is, Taras Politeko is a Ukrainian-Canadian artist who was trained in Soviet realist tradition, so pretty much can do whatever he wants with paint, you know, that incredible tradition. And he came across these paintings by the Luciano Fontana paintings, Concetto Speziale, that were actual tears in the surface. And so then he did a series responding to these tears, these cuts, and this is all trompe-l'oeil. So it's a very convincing trompe-l'oeil. It relates to an earlier series that he did of Kazimir Malevich, because Malevich painted so few works that often they were just being seen in reproduction in books. And so when he was a young student studying in the Soviet Union, he would often see the Malevich works with the page and the glare on the page. So he did a series called Glare. And what it is each page of the Malevich paintings with the glare of the page from looking at the book. So it's a reproduction of the book page. So, and you can see that this is sort of a next generation of what Michael was concerned with in thinking about, you know, that in the latency of political life, that and how it's represented through these kind of signifiers that seem very, very formalist, and yet that fusion is actually, you know, incredibly related to lived experience.
When I saw that, when we were walking through Michael's house, and I saw this, I said, "Oh wow, a Fontana!" And so anyway, I did a double take, but it's yes, a really amazing painting, I think, for all of those reasons. We're coming to the end of the walkthrough tour, but I think we would like to welcome some questions, both, I'm imagining, well, certainly I hope from this audience, but also can we take questions from online?
And it'll take a few minutes, I think, for folks online to type their questions. So you get the first dibs because you showed up today in person.
So we welcome questions anybody has, and we can move back through the space if you want to move. We don't have to stay in this corner.
Or no questions, that's possible too. We're also really happy to answer anything as we break out and just enjoy the show together. I don't know if we have any questions from online at all. Yet? No. Okay, thank you so much, everybody, for coming today, and please enjoy the show.